Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be discussing the incredible and historic role played by the forces of Australia and in New Zealand in defeating the Ottoman Empire in World War I and also in protecting the vulnerable Jewish community of Palestine as Rommel's army marched through North Africa. And thanks to the Battle of Alamein, this prevented a Holocaust in the land of Israel. And this is their remarkable story. So to discuss the incredible role played by Australian and New Zealand forces, I'm joined by Kelvin Crombie, who's an author and historian. Kelvin, it's a great pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report today.
Thanks, Simon. It's good to be here.
And can you share something of your incredible testimony of how you became interested in Israel, the Jewish people, and how ultimately you came to know the Lord in Israel?
Well, the interest in Israel and the Jewish people began when I was growing up in the rural area of Western Australia on a sheep, wheat and pig farm, ironically. And as a young fellow, I was very interested in Australia's military role in the Middle East. I had an uncle who died at Tobruk, and many years later I discovered I had a second cousin who was killed at the Battle of Alamein, a neighbour who was involved in what we call the light infantry, 10th Light Horse. So as a young fellow, I became interested in the Middle East because I was following the role of the Australian and New Zealand soldiers in that region. And in particular, I was interested in the uncle who died and never came back, and I asked a question as a young fella: what was he doing there? Why did he go over, and why did he die? So I began to read quite a bit of material as a young person of Australian and New Zealand's military role as part of, of course, the bigger British forces who were there in the Middle East. And as a result of it, I began to be interested in Palestine because of the First World War, the Light Horse, the Second World War, the role of the Anzac forces there, and began to expand my reading, I suppose. I mean, I'm talking about a young lad of 8, 9 or 10 years of age, and I used to get an encyclopedia set that came out once every week from the UK, Purnell's History of the Second World War. And I recall on one occasion there was a whole section on Hitler's final solution to the Jewish problem, and it was all about the Holocaust and about the death camps and concentration camps, etc. And I can still recall the photographs that were in that section. And as a young 10-year-old boy, they left quite a deep impression upon me. So then the question began to come into my mind: who are these people and why were they being persecuted in such a way? It's very interesting that in that same period of time, an Israeli family came to live in a farm in the same little area that I came from. Now, when you realise that Western Australia is the size of India, and when I was growing up at that stage, the population was a little over 1 million, perhaps 1,200,000. And most of those lived in the city. So it was a fairly isolated environment. So to have an Israeli family come to live in a farm in that same area where I came from, when I was getting interested in Israel, I could only see as the hand of God. It was well before I even knew that God sort of had an interest in me personally. So I got to know a bit more about Israel because of that connection. And there are a few other connections as well, a comment that my father made at the time of the Six-Day War. And I guess by the age of 12, all those little factors were combining and helping me to see that, yes, Israel is significant. And the Bible never played a factor in this because we were not from a Bible-believing family. We only went to church perhaps once a year if we were lucky. And I wasn't from a Jewish background. So these connections to Israel basically began because of this Australian and New Zealand military involvement in the region and the Israeli family. And by the age of 15, a person I used to go to school with once told me that I said to her that I would one day go to live in Israel. So I would believe it. It was true. By the age of 15, my mind was sort of already being focused upon the region of the Middle East. I had to go through university first before I finally came over to Israel. I went to university to study history and left before I completed my studies because I was more interested in going to the regions that I was interested in rather than reading about them in a book. And so I left Australia in 1978 at the age of 21, came over to the UK first and did all the things that wild colonial boys do over here. And I won't say any more because you'd have to edit out half the things I got up to. And Earl's Court and all that sort of stuff, you know, running of the bulls and the beer fest and all sorts of other wild things. But ultimately, I got to Israel. Now, before I left Australia, already I knew that I'd go to Israel and I knew that I'd find the answer to life. Whatever that was, I would find it in Israel. And when I got there in 1979, I went to a kibbutz in the northern part of Israel and I felt at home straight away. As soon as the aeroplane landed, I just actually felt as if I had arrived home. There was a certain shalom that came upon me at that time.
Know that feeling very well.
Many people have experienced that. Now, I wasn't at that stage a confessing Christian, so, you know, it was part of the journey, you might say. I went to a kibbutz called Mayan Baruch in the northern part of Israel, and it just so happened that that kibbutz was established by former Palmach soldiers, which are Jewish elite soldiers, force established in 1941, and also by South African veterans of the 8th Army. That was how the kibbutz was established, and so I had lots of contact with these veterans, because they'd all served with Australian and New Zealand and British soldiers during the war, and there was a certain rapport we had straight away. But while I was on the kibbutz, I was more interested in the hedonistic lifestyle that you would have on a kibbutz, and on one side, but on the other side I was also interested in why was I drawn to Israel in the first place. I was still on that search. Why did Israel always intrigue me as a kid? And I wanted to find the answer. And ultimately, I believe that the answer was in becoming an Israeli and serving in the army. You see, I felt there was something there in Israel, in society, even though the people are not perfect and the society was not perfect, you could see that. But nevertheless, there seemed to be a glue that was sort of keeping them together, and I really wanted to be part of that. So I thought, well, if I become an Israeli, so I asked, well, how do you become an Israeli? How do you serve in the army? And the answer came back, well, you've got to convert. Okay, I'll convert, no worries. So naive was I. And there was an English guy who was converting at the same time in order to go into the army. And he was further on the process than I was. I hadn't really even started. And so this guy, Andy was his name, began to explain to me what was involved. That was reading a lot of books, learning a lot of religious stuff, and then if you passed the test before the rabbis, you'd have to go off and they shipped you off to a place and have an operation. So ultimately I began to realize that the whole idea of converting to Judaism really wasn't where I was at, because I wasn't interested in anything religious. I just wanted to be part of society, and I wasn't interested in converting to Judaism. So I pulled out of the race really before I began, which left me in a bit of a quandary. I had this desire to be there and to be part of Israel, and until that point I thought, well, this is the way to do it. But now it was like the rug got pulled out from under my feet, and I began to think, well, where am I now? And my life began to twirl downwards, basically. And right at that juncture, God intervened. I didn't ask him to show up, he showed up. And a Christian girl came to the kibbutz, an American Christian girl, and began to witness to me, I think, the first or second day about Jesus. And I said, hang on, I'm not here to talk about this Jesus, to hear about this Jesus. I remember saying to her that if there was a God, he was the God of Israel and the Jewish people, and all you Christians were wrong. You're all hypocrites. Now, I'd been to all the churches around Britain and around Europe, and been to the Vatican, and been to all the cathedrals in Israel, and that for me was Christianity. That was the face of Jesus to me, and I wasn't interested in that stuff. So that's what I said to her. If there is a God of at all, is the God of Israel and the Jewish people. So she did the only thing she could do, which was to be quiet and to intercede. And I actually then got interested in the girl, which is quite interesting, and went with her down to Jerusalem for Easter of 1981. Between 1979, when I first got there in 1981, I'd been in and out of Israel a couple of times, and went to Jerusalem for Easter and Passover. Both the calendars came together on that particular occasion, as they do every now and again. And we went there for Passover, didn't do anything for me. Easter Friday, didn't do anything for me. And the last throw of the dice, you might say, was Resurrection Sunday morning at a place called the Garden Tomb. So I went to the dawn service. I mean, what would I want to go to the dawn service for? 5 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning. But anyhow, I showed up there with the group from the kibbutz, and a message was preached that day which turned my life upside down. It was preached by an Anglican minister, in other words, a guy with a dog collar, sort of bloke that I wouldn't have much to do with, but there he was preaching. We actually were put right up near this guy. The ushers sort of took us right up and found a couple of seats, and we couldn't get out if we wanted to. And this man, his name was David Price. He's still alive. He was the minister of Christ Church Jerusalem. Now, I didn't know anything about Christ Church Jerusalem, didn't know it was an evangelical Anglican congregation, didn't know it belonged to an organisation called CMJ, which had been around for 150 years, had an interest in ministry to Jewish people, didn't know anything about that. But this man preached about Jesus being a Jew. Now, I must have heard that at some stage in the past, but on that occasion, it really impacted me. And I often thought later, well, why? Well, obviously it was God's moment for me, but I suppose in a sense, hearing that Jesus was a Jew, I probably must have thought, well, if he's a Jew, if he was here today, he'd be an Israeli. I happen to like Israelis, so perhaps, and the process continued. But David also mentioned that Jesus was the Passover lamb, and also briefly mentioned something like the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel in the present time would precede the return of Jesus to Jerusalem at some stage in the future. So he was drawing these two facets together. Okay, what I had seen as Christianity and Jesus being over there, and Israel and the Jewish people being here, and he was drawing them together in a way which I hadn't seen or heard before. Now, I didn't repent at that occasion and accept Jesus as my saviour. I tried to do what Elijah once did when he was confronted. I took off into the wilderness, you might say. I tried to get away from what I had just heard, but couldn't do it. And ultimately, I came back here to England. I worked in a farm in Kent. In those period of time when I ran out of money, I'd come back here and work and whatever else. And I came back to this little farm and couldn't find shalom, couldn't find peace. It was like I had been confronted with something, and that was it. And so I wrote a letter to this girl on the kibbutz, and I said, listen, you better come back and tell me what you did, because my life's changed and I don't know where I'm at. So she did. She came back and broke off our relationship straight away. And then shortly later, explained to me the way of salvation. So I repented of my former life of sin and confessed Jesus as my covenant partner and saviour, and was miraculously born again. I had an amazing experience of the Holy Spirit just coming into my life, and I was transformed instantaneously. So now, a new person. But I knew my place wasn't in the UK, so only a few months later I was back in Israel again and didn't go back to the kibbutz. I went to Jerusalem and I began to work in a hospital for handicapped children, for Jewish and Arab children. And I actually ended up by spending as much time with the Arab kids as I did with the Jewish kids, because they were often neglected, so I'd take them out. So now I had another experience, you might say. On the kibbutz, it was just with Israelis and Jewish people, but now it was also with the Arab people as well. So now began sort of a new process in my life. It was, I'm living in Israel. I've got a better understanding now what it's all about, but also I have to realize there were Arab people as well. So I began to sort of spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out, well, how do they fit into the equation? I used to go and visit refugee camps and so on and so forth. And in time, I then worked in another hospital, a geriatric and psychiatric hospital with the Holocaust survivors. And that's where I met my wife, Lexi, who was a Dutch nurse. And then some time later, I began to volunteer for an organisation called the International Christian Embassy during the Feast of Tabernacles. And it was during that period of time that my wife, Lexi, and I, after we were married, we were attending the West Jerusalem Baptist Church there for a while under Bob Lindsay. And we finding that we couldn't go to church because we actually often had to work on Saturday through our jobs and used to worship on Saturday. And we began to go to Christ Church in the evenings, Sunday evenings. And a new minister had just come in at Christ Church Jerusalem. A new minister had just come in, and we just felt that the Lord was leading us to this congregation. And so in time we became involved in the ministry at Christ Church Jerusalem. And then in 1986, they actually asked me to come onto staff, which was a big, big risk for them, you know, a good, solid British Anglican organisation asking a wild colonial boy who wasn't British and wasn't Anglican to come and work in their organisation. But Alfred had a desire to reach out to Jewish people, who were Israelis particularly, who were coming to visit this historic location. It's the first Protestant church in the Middle East, and it's the beginning of British involvement in the Middle East. The British consulate was based there. It's the seat of the Anglican bishop when it began, and the first bishop, as you know, in Jerusalem was a former rabbi called Michael Solomon Alexander. And architecturally, it was built to resemble a synagogue. So on a monthly basis, we used to have between 500 and 800 Israelis would come to visit to hear about the history. So my task was to give them the historical background, but also to explain to them the ministry philosophy of the people who established the work in the first place, which was to present Jesus as Messiah to the Jewish people. And as a result of that, having to do lots of history, I had to major upon the theme of the British involvement in the Eastern Mediterranean from the period 1798, when it really began, up until 1948. That was the area that I actually ended up by sort of majoring upon. It's the only way you could actually understand why that British presence was there, why there was a Protestant presence there, when under the Turks the Protestants weren't even officially recognised. And as a result of doing this background research, I had to delve quite a bit into the British involvement. Came over here to the UK on numerous occasions, accessed the archives, the National Archives and Bodleian Library in Oxford and so on and so forth, and began to get a better feel of that whole subject matter, which until today I'm very thankful that I had the opportunity of doing so. And it, in a sense, it rounded out some of the education I had as a young fellow back in Australia, where it was basically just about Australian and New Zealand involvement here, but now I was actually having to see that it was part of a much bigger picture.
Amazing. And today we're really paying tribute to the forces of the Anzacs, known as the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, that played a huge role during the First World War. Can you share something about the incredible historical role played by the Anzac forces in actually defeating the Ottoman Empire, who were actually opposing God's plans and purposes for the establishment of a Jewish state in the ancient covenant homeland?
Well, first thing we have to realise is that the Anzac forces, the Australian and New Zealand forces, only came over to this region, okay, to the Eastern Mediterranean region, as part of the overall British forces, the overall British objectives. And in the First World War, we were actually aiming towards the Western Front, but then Turkey entered into the war, and so as a result of it, there was a new dynamic, because the Suez Canal, on one side was Egypt, which was controlled by the British, on the other side, of course, was the area controlled by the Ottoman Turks. And so now the defence of the Suez Canal was of prime importance. So instead of the Anzac forces continuing through the Suez Canal on the way up to France and Britain to train, they decided to station them there in Egypt, and they would then also defend the Suez Canal against an impending Turkish attack. Well, then at the same time, the Turks, the Russians were in need of support, and so the decision was made to get help through the Russians, and we would send our supplies up to them through the Dardanelles and through the Bosphorus under Constantinople, through the Black Sea to the Russians. And that's the background for the Gallipoli campaign. And so now the Australians and New Zealanders would be involved in the Gallipoli campaign alongside British and French and Indian soldiers, and interestingly enough, a small Jewish unit called the Zion Mule Corps, which is the first time that Jewish soldiers fought under the lapel of the Star of David. So they also went to serve in Gallipoli. So the Gallipoli campaign was significant. In Britain, very few people really understand the significance, but in Australia and New Zealand, they believe it's the beginning of their nationhood in many ways. It's the first time they fought as sovereign nations. But the beginning of the modern process for the restoration of Israel also began at Gallipoli. And this is a very, very important factor to realise. The Gallipoli campaign opened, you might say, Pandora's box. Because at that stage, the Russians then made an ultimatum. And they said, once you've captured this region, thank you very much, you have to handball it over to us, to the Russian. And so the British then began to realise, well, if the Russians have control of that region, we had better make sure that the area on both sides of the Suez Canal is doubly secure for the sake of our link to the Eastern Empire, which is India and Australia and New Zealand and the other parts of the empire down there. So the Gallipoli campaign set in motion this whole British desire to safeguard the region of the Suez Canal. So even though militarily we were defeated in Gallipoli, when we came back, the next process was to defend the Suez Canal from an impending Turkish attack from the Sinai side. So in 1916, our troops went across to the Sinai, which was British yeomanry and British infantry, plus Australian and New Zealand horsemen, the light horse and the mounted rifles. And then from 1916 onwards, we're involved in creating a buffer zone to hinder the attack of the Turks in the Suez Canal. And by the end of 1916, we actually had taken the entire Sinai, so there had been a sufficient buffer zone. But by that stage, a new government had just come into power. David Lloyd George, Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, Foreign Minister. And both of those men believed that it was incumbent upon Britain to make sure that the entire province of Syria, which is modern-day Syria and Lebanon, Jordan and Israel, that actually would not fall under, that region would not fall under a potential belligerent power in the future, be it Germany, if the Germans won the war, or be it France or even Russia. They had to make sure that that region was really, really secure. And so the plan from the beginning of 1917 was to capture the remainder of the province of Syria, and that would basically be done with a British force. So it was British troops, Australian troops, and New Zealand troops who then went in and did the bulk of the fighting, at least in 1917. Now, if we were going to go in there and defeat the Turks in that region, then the British had to make sure they had a very, very good solution for the future governance of that region. Now, they already had a treaty with the French called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They already had an understanding with King Hussein of the Hejaz for what we call the Arab Revolt, etc., etc. But as far as southern Syria, Palestine, the Holy Land was concerned, that was an area open for special deliberations, and so on and so forth. And so Britain now realised we have to make sure that region in particular does not fall under a belligerent power in the future. So now negotiations began with the Jewish Zionist organisation. So two things were now actually happening in 1917. The conquest of the land, which had to be taken from the Turks, otherwise they'd retain control. And under an Islamic entity like Turkey was, and it was the head of the Caliphate of Islam at the time, there's no way there would be an independent Jewish homeland there. And so at the same time, Britain had to work out a policy which would safeguard their own interests in the region, but none of Britain's allies would ever allow Britain to have sole control over that region. The French wouldn't, the Russians wouldn't, the Italians wouldn't, the Vatican wouldn't, and for sure the Americans wouldn't condone a purely British control over the Holy Land. So Britain had to work out a solution, a viable solution. So you had two things happening, and it all culminated on the 31st of October 1917, when we had two big defeats at Gaza, and so it was decided that there would be an attack upon Beersheba, which is the southern end of the Turkish defensive line, and that battle would take place on the 31st of October 1917, in which British forces, the infantry, would attack from the west and slightly from the south, and the Australian and New Zealand horsemen would come around to the south of Beersheba and attack it from the east, where they weren't expecting an attack. This is the desert. And they had to take the city or the town in one day in order to make sure they didn't lose their element of surprise, but also for water supplies as well. So that was the context of the military battle, and that began on the 31st of October 1917. Contrary to what most Aussies think, most of the fighting that day was actually done by British infantry, who had to attack trenches from the west and from the south. And on the eastern side, it was the New Zealanders and the Australians on horses. They had to actually capture the ancient Beersheba, called Tel El Sabe. And once that was done in the afternoon by the New Zealanders, then the Australian Light Horse galloped in at the end of the day, the 4th and 12th Light Horse Regiments of the 4th Light Horse Brigade. They galloped in and effected the final victory. Now, that was now the victory on the ground, the first major victory of the campaign. But on that very same day, at about the same time as the victory was attained, the cabinet was meeting up here in London. And on their agenda was the future, the political future of the land of Israel. The Jewish organisation, the Zionists, had given a proposal, which was that there would be a Jewish national home in Palestine. Now the British cabinet actually had to vote on that. Were they actually going to condone such a proposal? And they voted unanimously for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And so you had two things actually happening on the same day at roughly the same time.
Amazing. And we've got a clip to go to now that's original archive footage of the First World War.
The Turkish armies are in retreat, and General Allenby is in hot pursuit. He wants to destroy as much of the enemy as he can while he has the upper hand. He knows there is plenty of fight left in the Turks. They may be retreating, but they are not giving up. Instead of continuing his drive to the north, Allenby turns to the east, toward the holy city of Jerusalem. The symbolic history of that ancient city, sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews, is more important at the moment than another great victory against the Turks. Lloyd George has already told Allenby to take Jerusalem before Christmas. The religious significance is not lost on Christians among the British troops.
Ford's Tin Lizzies ploughed through the sandhills and raced along the coast tracks, where Pharaoh's war chariots had travelled. A derelict tank lay in no man's land, within rifle shot of where Samson's primitive weapon of the jawbone of an ass had proved more deadly.
Well, you know, in some respects, it was a crusade. But Allenby is really sensitive about this because he doesn't want it to be called a crusade. A lot of his soldiers were Muslim. I mean, his labor force, for example. He also had Indian troops. And so he doesn't want this sort of Christian versus Muslim conflict. And he just doesn't want it called that at all. But you couldn't help but be aware, if you were a British soldier, that you were going into Bethlehem or that you were getting closer to Jerusalem. And so even though Allenby doesn't want it really talked about as a crusade, you know, some of the rank and file did think that way. And I think it was some motivation for some of these British soldiers.
On a night of rain and bitter cold, British forces attacked the holy city of Jerusalem on December 7th, 1917. The enemy offers strong resistance at first, but they are only 15,000 men against overwhelming enemy numbers. They begin to withdraw from the city. 4 centuries of Ottoman rule have come to an end. On December 11th, General Allenby enters Jerusalem on foot out of respect for the city. He is the 34th conqueror of Jerusalem in its long, volatile past. After a campaign that has lasted 40 days and 40 nights, with the loss of 18,000 men, the British soldiers have delivered a Christmas present to their nation. In the city, Allenby delivers a proclamation to the crowd and dignitaries gathered.
Since your city is regarded with affection by the adherents of 3 of the great religions of mankind, and its soil has become consecrated by the prayers and pilgrimages of multitudes of devout people of those 3 religions for many centuries, therefore do I make it known to you that every sacred building, monument, holy spot, shrine, or customary place of prayer of whatsoever form of the 3 religions will be maintained and protected according to the existing customs and beliefs of those to whose faiths they are sacred.
The Turks lose 25,000 men in the struggle that began October 31st. They are down but not out, and still hold a strong defensive line from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea. General Allenby's great victory has no effect on the bloodbath that continues on the Western Front. In fact, it looks as though the Germans might win the struggle. Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff are planning a great offensive for the spring of 1918. They have many more divisions of troops to use against the British and French, brought in from the fight against Russia, where the revolution of 1917 has toppled the Tsarist government of Nicholas II. The Bolsheviks have taken over, led by Vladimir Lenin. He quickly signs treaties with Berlin and Istanbul that take his new communist state out of the war. So Germany is free to concentrate all its strength on the Western Front. In the United States, Congress declares war on Germany in April 1917. President Woodrow Wilson promises to send troops in the hundreds of thousands to help Britain and France. But it takes time to train and organize this massive force and get them over to Europe. Lloyd George fears the Americans will not arrive in time to do any good against the impending German onslaught. So the Prime Minister tells General Allenby to send most of his army back to France.
But Lloyd George is also a great supporter of fighting in the Middle East. And he quarrels a lot with his generals about the allocation of resources to these theaters. And he is determined by late 1917, 1918 that this is going to be the British theater. That he's just going to stay on the defensive in the West, basically wait for the American forces to build up in Europe. And he hoped even to substitute American soldiers for British soldiers, which he was going to send to the Middle East. But this was going to be his theater, but the Germans wouldn't play that game. And so when they attack, suddenly the Western Front is once again, first and foremost.
The British offensive in Palestine is stopped cold, just when it is poised to capture Damascus and press on to Istanbul itself. Allenby can do nothing but watch his opportunity slip away. and watched the Ottoman army use the time to prepare their defenses for the battles that lie ahead. Yes, the holy city of Jerusalem is in the Crusaders' hands, but peace still lies somewhere beyond its walls.
And that was the archive footage of the battle for Jerusalem that occurred in December 1917. Kelvin, the taking of Jerusalem by General Allenby's forces was hugely significant. What did that mean to the Jewish people and to the restoration of Israel as a nation?
Well, the capture of Jerusalem, of course, happened about 5 weeks after the capture of Beersheba and the issuing of the Balfour Declaration, which gave tremendous impetus to Jewish interests in returning to the land. There had already been a desire from the Jewish leadership to establish a fighting force. Now, the Zion Mule Corps, which served at Gallipoli, was the beginning point, and Zev Jabotinsky was the brainwave behind that. But he still was agitating for a Jewish legion. And so the British government then became more interested in this, and so a Jewish legion was established in 1917 in the period of the campaigns in the land of Israel. But it wasn't to be called the Jewish Legion because there was actually some opposition from Jewish people here in this land. So it was called the 38th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. It was just sort of colloquially known as the Jewish Legion. But that was a Jewish fighting force comprised of Jewish soldiers that were from Britain and other countries as well that joined up. And then the 39th Battalion Royal Fusiliers was established by Jewish volunteers in the United States. And they actually, many of them had to go to Canada to sort of join up. And Ben Gurion was one of those, who was the first Prime Minister, and Ben Tzvi, the second President. They all got involved and became part of the 39th Battalion Royal Fusiliers.
Oh, amazing.
And then later the 40th Battalion Royal Fusiliers was established by volunteers that were living in the land of Israel, the areas captured by our forces between Beersheba and Jerusalem. So impetus was now really going as far as the Jewish people were concerned. And then we get to Jerusalem itself, and it was highly significant that Jerusalem would be captured. And it would be a propaganda scoop par excellence for the Allies to capture Jerusalem, particularly if there'd be no damage to the city. And so actually the capture of Jerusalem took place in 2 phases. The first phase actually failed. That was in November of 1917, and then they had to regroup and change some of the troops around. And then the second phase began on the 7th of December, ending the late afternoon, the 7th of December, into the 8th, and then by the 9th, early in the morning of the 9th, the Turkish forces had withdrawn to the north of Jerusalem, and there was still a bit of fighting. Some of the forces had to go around to the north. Most of the forces were actually attacking from the west, and the 53rd Welsh Division was actually coming up from the south. And the only Anzac forces involved in the capture of Jerusalem was the 10th Light Horse Regiment from Western Australia, actually, because it wasn't an area that the horses would actually be able to go up to because it was wet and it was slippery and you had to take lots of fodder up as well. So it was decided that it was mainly a fight for the infantry. You have a lot of people say that Jerusalem was taken without a shot being fired. Well, that's not really fair upon all the infantry, the British infantry, who lost their lives in the weeks before moving up to Jerusalem. And of course there were Australians who were dismounted as well, and New Zealanders. So Jerusalem was captured on the 9th. And the big event was 2 days later when General Allenby would come in to effect the final surrender. And on that occasion, he came up from his headquarters to a place called what is now the Anglican International School in Prophet Street in Jerusalem. And there he swapped his car for a horse, basically. And then he drove down to Jerusalem and dismounted. And then he walked in. And the reason he actually got off his horse and walked in was because he was told to get off his horse and walk in. It's nothing that Allenby himself had decided he was going to do. In actual fact, everything that Allenby did and said on that occasion was dictated to him by the government, by a number of people that were involved in it, because they realised this was an incredibly important date, an event, because 19 years before, the German Kaiser had entered into Jerusalem, and he'd come in on his big white horse, and they actually levelled the moat at Jaffa Gate in order for him to come in. So in 1917, they're fighting against the very same person. They're fighting against the German Kaiser. So rather than riding in as a victorious general on a big white horse, it would be good to actually do something completely different to what the German Kaiser had done. So it was a propaganda scoop par excellence. So get off and walk in and go through the gate rather than riding in. And Allenby didn't get down and pray. You hear a lot of people saying he got down and prayed and all that sort of stuff. He didn't do anything of the nature. He went in and he stood on the steps of the citadel. The citadel, incidentally, was the only building left standing by the Romans when they destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. And when he was on the steps of the citadel, much of the speaking that day was actually done by a Greek Orthodox monk who read out the different proclamations. And he was surrounded by a guard of honour, a semicircle guard of honour comprised of 110 British soldiers who were representative of Welsh, Irish, Scottish and English, and then 70 or so Australian and New Zealand soldiers were there as well. And it's very interesting that the buildings closest to Allenby, and those photographs that you see it on the clippage, all those photos are actually taken from the buildings of Christchurch, Jerusalem, which is where British involvement in the Middle East, or in the land of Israel particularly, began 70, 80 odd years before. So it was a very interesting twist of history when it all came down.
Interesting. And if we go on and move on, that Britain and France were given the mandates by the League of Nations. Britain was given, Israel and Jordan, and the French were given Syria and Lebanon as a providence to prepare those nations for nationhood and statehood. And then, of course, in the interwar years, we had the rise of Arab nationalists, particularly attacking the vulnerable Jewish communities there, until we really started World War II, when Hitler decided to invade Poland in September 1939. In which case that Britain then entered the war. And I think it was in the 1940s? Was it 1940 or 1941 that the Anzac forces then returned again to the land of Israel, or the British Mandate of Palestine, where they received an incredibly warm welcome by the Israelis. Can you say something about the affection that Israelis have for Australian and New Zealanders?
Well, I think the affection has to go back to the fact that in 1940, when our troops first landed in the Middle East, we set off in 1939 and arrived in the beginning of 1940. Many of them actually remembered the troops who had been there in the First World War. And they remembered the soldiers on the big horses and the big hats and a generous hand. They used to sort of just give out money and lollies to the kids, etc. So some of the people remembered that. But when the soldiers arrived there in 1940, the New Zealanders were sent down to Egypt. They became the garrison force there. And the 3 Australian divisions who came up, the 6th, 7th and 9th divisions, they were garrisoned in Palestine, as it was known as at the time. And they did their basic training because many of the regular British troops had been withdrawn back here for home defence and also for going to France. So it was understandable that they would be replaced by troops from Australia and New Zealand primarily, who would do their basic training. So the Australians actually had a lot of daily contact with the Jewish people and the Arab people as well, of course, in Palestine. But they had a lot of contact with the Jewish people. Now, I've met and interviewed lots of Jewish people who were there at that time, including Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister, and Uzi Narkis, the general who captured Jerusalem in 1967. I had the pleasure of interviewing those men. And as soon as you began to talk to them about the Aussie soldiers, immediately they began to grin and smile because they remembered the attitude of those blokes. But the appreciation of the Jewish community towards the soldiers of our two countries stemmed not just from the fact that they were generous and warm-hearted, etc., but it's what they actually achieved on the battlefront. And we can't take their involvement away from the bigger picture, which is the fact there were British soldiers there, and there were Indian soldiers. Later, there were South African soldiers, and there were free French and free Poles and free Czechs, etc. So that was the bigger component. But there were 4 Anzac divisions who were there in the Middle East, and that has to be taken into consideration. Now, initially, the Middle East was secure, safe, because Italy hadn't joined the war at that stage, and so there was no reason for a conflict in the Middle East. But once Italy joined the war on the side of the Germans at the time when France fell, then the dynamics of the Middle East changed completely, because when France fell, it now meant that all French possessions also came under the control of the Vichy government, which meant that Syria and Lebanon, now essentially either neutral or potentially pro-German, okay? And it meant that now Libya, being an Italian colony, came into the conflict. So one of the first things that Mussolini wanted to do was to establish a big Italian empire. So he sent a force into Egypt to capture the Suez Canal, and he sent a force in to Greece to capture Greece. Now, ultimately, both of those thrusts failed. Okay, he was driven out by General Wavell, and of course, don't forget, you've got the 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats were involved in this, as well as the Aussie and Kiwi soldiers, and they drove the Italians out of Egypt back into Libya. Now, Mussolini's ally, Hitler, wasn't very amused with this. But then the Italians were getting defeated in Greece. And that was even more dangerous as far as Hitler was concerned. And so at that stage, Hitler made a decision to send an army of 200,000 soldiers into Greece to help the Italians. Now, that was actually not so good from an Allied perspective, because if the Germans came into Greece, it would place them very, very close to the Suez Canal. And so a force of 58,000 Allied soldiers was sent in, that's British, Australian, New Zealand soldiers, were sent in to help the Greeks against this massive 200,000 strong German army. What chance did we have? Virtually zilch. But when our troops went in there, we were actually based above a city called Thessalonica, because that's where the Germans would come down. 56,000 Jewish people lived in Thessalonica. So how safe were they at that period of time? How vulnerable were they at that time? So when the German army actually invaded and conquered Thessalonica on the 9th of April 1941, their community thereafter was decimated. 96% of that Jewish community by 1943 had been sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau and had been killed. So it gives you an idea that any area where the German army was going to conquer, it was not good at all for the Jewish people who were living there. So what happened in Greece would happen anywhere else where the German army invaded.
Yeah. And can you really talk about, down sadly to the last 10 minutes, I'm going to do a whole programme on this issue alone, but can we talk about the Battle of Tobruk, because that was highly significant, as well as the incredible battle for Al Alamein, who was led by General Montgomery, who defeated the Nazis. And you're saying before the programme really that Rommel's plan, or the Nazi plan, was to conquer the Suez Canal and also get hold of the oil fields in Iraq, in Mosul, to actually defeat the British Empire and defeat the British.
That's entirely true. I mean, as I said, there was a desire to help make sure that Greece was secure, and then they took Crete as well, so that made it very, very vulnerable. The Suez Canal was very vulnerable now because of the fact that the Germans were in Greece and Crete. So then the Germans under General Rommel began to attack, and again their thrust was towards the Suez Canal, across the Suez Canal, and into the oil fields of Mosul. And they almost succeeded, except for one place called Tobruk. And because our forces who were driven out of Libya made a beeline for Tobruk, which is a large and important seaport. And most of that was the Australian 9th Division, but there were also British troops, and there were Jewish soldiers from Palestine who then congregated at Tobruk. So Rommel couldn't continue any further while Tobruk held out. So the survival of all those 700,000 Jewish people in the Middle East really depended upon Tobruk holding out. Ultimately, Tobruk did fall in 1942. And at that stage, the German army then made a beeline again for the Suez Canal, and they were stopped at a place called El Alamein. And the battle there began on the 1st of July 1942. So the welfare of 700,000 Jewish people who lived in that entire region was now dependent upon the outcome of the Battle of El Alamein. Now, what a lot of people are unaware of is that as soon as Tobruk fell in June 1942, the Nazi High Command, the SS High Command in Berlin, made a decision to establish a specialised murder squad called the Einsatzkommando Egypt. Now, the Einsatz, or the Einsatzgruppen, were specialised murder squads who went into Poland and Eastern Europe from 1940 onwards, or 1939 onwards, and their role, apart from killing political opponents, was to actually kill Jewish people. So they might have killed perhaps 700,000 up to 1 million Jewish people by the time we get to the middle of 1942. And so one small group called the Einsatzkommando Egypt was now formed, and their task was to come down, join with Rommel's forces once they won at El Alamein, and then go in and, with the help of local collaborators, begin the task of destroying the Jewish communities throughout that entire region. And so there's a different component now to the El Alamein battle that we actually might not have seen before, because we've seen it before as a military conflict. But now we have to realise that if we lost that battle, what would have been the outcome for those 700,000 Jewish people who lived in that region? So, thankfully, Bezrat Hashem, we would say, thanks to the Lord, the victory was gained at El Alamein. General Montgomery was the Allied commander at that stage, and you had all those different forces, British, Indian, South African, Australian, New Zealand, were all involved in stopping Rommel's forces at El Alamein, and victory was gained. And you can well imagine how that victory was taken by the Jewish communities throughout that entire region. They were ecstatic. And it's very interesting that some years later, General Montgomery made an official visit to Palestine on behalf of the British government, and the Jewish leadership then gave him a special presentation. And that presentation is a little Hebrew Bible, or a Tanakh. We have it here at the moment.
Fantastic.
And this little Hebrew Bible...
Just show it up to your camera there, Calvin.
And this little Hebrew Bible is the Hebrew Tanakh. And with it were words on a parchment that said, to Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery, the gallant leader of the victorious British forces, by whose hand God has placed salvation in Zion in the days of El Alamein. And so this little memento reveals the depth of understanding the Jewish community had to the victory of El Alamein. And this Bible was actually given to Montgomery. He then gave it to the Bishop of Rochester, who was then the president or involved with CMJ. And the Bishop of Rochester gave it to CMJ to sell. Thankfully, they didn't sell it, and it's still in the possession of CMJ, either in their museum in Christchurch, Jerusalem, or over here on the road, so to speak. But it actually speaks volumes about the appreciation of the Jewish leadership to the role that these forces played. And don't forget, the majority of these troops were Gentile soldiers, the role they played in actually helping to halt the Holocaust from entering into the Middle East.
I mean, you've written a book here called El Alamein. There's a book, and definitely recommend that if you've got time to actually buy this book and go and read it, because this is a story that I would like to do when you come back next on the Middle East Report. We'll do a whole program on the Battle of Alamein, because it's a story that very few people actually realise, and maybe in so many of those British, Australian and Kiwi forces that were fighting against Rommel's army in North Africa maybe also didn't understand the true significance of this battle, that this battle not only defeated Rommel's North African corps, but also it protected the Jewish people living under the British Mandate of Palestine from a Holocaust.
And I think our societies, our countries, need to actually know this unknown story, basically. I mean, thanks to two German historians, Malman and Coopers, the SS documentation has come to the foreground. They've also accessed the minutes of various meetings between Hajj Ahmed al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, and Hitler. We've also got lots of documents on the German Foreign Office. So it was very, very clear what their agenda was. So our nations played a huge role in helping to halt the Holocaust from entering into the Middle East and potentially saving the lives of 700,000 Jewish people. So if Rommel had got into the Middle East with the aid of the SS and the local collaborators, then the entire Jewish national home would have been destroyed, and there would have been no foundation there for what the Jewish people could later build upon to establish their state in 1948.
Kelvin, sadly we're down to the last 5 minutes, but so I've got two questions to ask you before the end of the programme. The first one is, how significant has been the role played by the Australian and Kiwi forces in not only defeating the Ottoman Empire, but also coming to the rescue of the Jewish population of Palestine during the Battle of Alamein? And what significant role does this play today in Australian politics and history?
Well, I think the role, as we've just outlaid, is very significant. And but I like to always emphasise that we didn't come across because we had a role to play by ourselves. It was part of the overall British objective. And I think it's important for Britain to realise too that in God's overall plans and purposes, you were the nation. You were the Cyrus nation that God used. Now, you might have made a few mistakes after 1917, 1918. We know all about that. But never forget the role that was played up until that point. So the Aussie and Kiwi soldiers did play a huge role, yes, but it was within this bigger perspective. Both world wars, very significant. And then when the State of Israel was established in 1948, our nations, Australia and New Zealand, voted in favour of the partition plan of 1947. And henceforth, in most instances, the Australian government has had a good, positive attitude towards Israel. There's been a bit of a bump along the way, I think, with the New Zealanders and occasionally with the Australians. But I think most Australians and New Zealanders need to realise, as do most British people and others, is that the existence of Israel is not only a testimony to the fact that there is a God who keeps his covenant promises, and that is very, very important for all Christians to realise. But if the state of Israel is destroyed, then that's like the front line of Western democracy. And so every Western democratic nation in the world should actually take heed of the fact that Israel is extremely important for the overall preservation of Western democracy.
Absolutely. And also you're here on a speaking tour. So can you share with us where you're going to be this weekend for any of our viewers who actually want to come and listen to Kelvin's talk where he's talking about keeping covenant?
Well, this weekend I'm at the CFI conference at Eastbourne. And next week there are different locations. I may just suggest that if people are interested, they would just click onto the website for Christian Friends for Israel, and the itinerary would be there.
So fantastic. So that's just a reminder that if you're interested in hearing Calvin speak, which you should do, just look at the Christian Friends of Israel website with all the details of Calvin's speaking engagements, and they'll be happy to give it to you, or just phone up the office of CFI and they'd be willing to help. Calvin, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. I could quite happily do another program with you, just discussing really the Battle of Alamein in itself, as well as talking about the First World War. And I think, isn't it, it's so important that as Christians we understand history, because we can't understand the present and we can't understand the future without understanding history, and certainly the significance that our nations have played in establishing the State of Israel, fulfilling God's plans and purposes for Israel and the Jewish people.
I couldn't agree more, and that's part of the reason why we're trying to do this right now. We've established a little work called Heritage Resources, and that's what we're dedicating our time to, is just trying as much as possible to bring out these historical pearls. Not that it's just an interest in history, but that those pearls can actually help us to see what it means for the future.
Absolutely. And you've written a couple of books. So if some of our viewers are interested in what you have to read, this is Calvin's latest book called Three Sons of Abraham. And we've got one more. Just this one is In Covenant with Jesus as well. And these are available on Calvin's website. Calvin, I want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure too.
And I want to thank you all for watching today's program. We've learned so much about the role played by the Anzac forces. They're the forces of Australia and New Zealand combined with the British forces to defeat the Ottoman Empire, which would then lead to the establishment of the State of Israel, in which the British were entrusted with the British mandate through the Balfour Declaration of 1917 to prepare the Jewish people for self-determination and the establishment and emergence of a Jewish state. And I've also heard through this program the incredible Battle of Alamein, which was highly significant because that battle prevented the Nazis from defeating the British in Egypt and conquering the Suez Canal, and eventually would have led to the Holocaust of over 700,000 Jewish people living under the British mandate of Palestine. So we have to pay tribute to the incredible role played by the Anzac forces in protecting Israel and the Jewish people. And this song is in tribute to what was emerged at that time for the first time in over 1,700 years, and that was the establishment of a Jewish fighting force defending the Jewish people for the first time. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
שרה בלב כמיה, על נשרה שבערבת התחול, על אהוב נפשה מתגעגע, איגרותיו ליקרות מכל. על אהוב נפשה מתגעגע, איגרותיו ליקרות מכל. אוי שירי, שירת נערה אוהבת,